So to begin introducing Jennifer Siegal, mobility is an idea that is central to our investigations as architects and designers. The movement of goods and services, materials and labor, weather and people direct our responses. Locally, we might be interested in the movement of the body through space and air through a room. Outside, we see watersheds, border crossings, freeway systems, and migratory paths. We are, as architects, in the business of reading and acting in response to movement. Our responses, however, are almost always fixed. Fixed to the land and fixed to the many systems and processes that we have inherited from earlier generations of business people and designers. These invariably result in a traditionally sited architecture. Jennifer Siegal has taken another approach. Her practice, the Office of Mobile Design, is positioned off of site. Or rather, OMD's site is moved. It is moved into the Factory and Materials Research Lab with the aim of finding more sustainable and responsible ways to design and deliver buildings. As a central figure in the recent movement towards prefabricated architecture, OMD is making a compelling argument that by remaining mobile and by rejecting many of the traditional means and methods through which we design and deliver architecture, we can make buildings that are more expressly positioned in the world. By designing to the specificity a controlled fabrication environment provides, architecture can reflect the precision of the hand through a 21st century technology and not simply through a instrument. Through a willingness to be mobile in conception, process, and delivery, maybe a project can ultimately be truly and sensitively fixed to the land. Jennifer Siegal is a graduate of SciArc and was the 2003 Loeb Fellow at Harvard's School of Design, where she explored the use of intelligent kinetic and lightweight materials. She has been resident at the Chinati Foundation, a fellow at the McDowell Colony, and is the inaugural Julia Schulman Institute Fellow at Woodbury University in Los Angeles. She is editor of Mobile, The Art of Portable Architecture, and More Mobile, Portable Architecture for Today, and was the founder and series editor of Materials Monthly, which was published by Princeton Architectural Press. Her monograph was published in 2005. So with that, I'll leave you Jennifer Siegal.
Okay, testing. Can you hear me? Is that loud enough? Yes? Okay, good. I'm going to sit down. It's a long trip from Los Angeles. My arms are tired. I want to thank you all so much for inviting me to be here at Rice. It's an honor. My former professor, Lars Larup, was a big influence on a lot of my work, and certainly probably an influence on a lot of you, whether you know it now or whether you feel it in the future. And it's also a pleasure to see John Kasparian, who has, I believe, shaped this institution in a strong way, and will again affect all of your lives, in 5 to 10 years, when you sort of are aware of how much influence these people have on you. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about mobile, prefabricated, and deployable architecture, my passion. Let's see. A couple books that I put out in 2002 and then in 2008 speak more fully about some of these concepts and show examples, I think, in a greater light of the work that I'm going to show today. I'm also a firm believer in collaborative spirit, and that architecture is certainly influenced not just by, the personal self, but by the arts, by nature, by the landscape, and to look outside of the discipline in which you exist in is truly the way in which to pursue your passions. So anyone who lives in Los Angeles is on some level aware of issues of mobility. At the risk of restating the obvious, getting around requires vehicles. As a nomad and Angelino, I have been consumed with the question of what kind. Not only am I concerned with environmental consequences of automobility or dromology, a term coined by Paul Virilio meaning the science of travel, but I'm equally interested in using design to affect social mobility. Here's an example of MIT's Media Lab's new electric robotic wheeled kit car, where this is something that Bill Mitchell's been producing with some students at the Media Lab, where this unit can be folded up, and with the swipe of your ATM card, you can drive off and then reinsert it when you're done with it. Almost like a zip car, but in a smaller level. In fact, you could say that my preoccupation with devising portable structures came out of my family's own economic history. My grandfather had a hot dog cart in New York City, and 2 generations later, while putting myself through graduate school at SciArc, I did as well. So it was not a leap, but rather a logical move when I founded Office of Mobile Design in 1998 as a way to actively engage in designing non-permanently sited structures that move across and rest lightly upon the land. My work seeks to rethink and reestablish methods of building that contrast with the generic clutter that increasingly crowds our landscape. I've been inspired by St. Elia's Futurist Manifesto, and I share in his philosophy that, quote, we no longer believe in the monumental, the heavy and static, and have enriched our sensibilities with a taste for lightness, transience, and practicality. Associated here in a region of instability, this is an image between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, where I lived for a number of years, where the threat of war, which is constant, it's easy to dismantle and remove this gas station. So this desire for the active, mobile, and everywhere dynamic that characterized the Italian futurist machine aesthetic infuses our work at OMD, represented in the rock climber whose dynamic form responds to the static rock face, or the work of a parkour whose efficient and quick mobility overcomes larger obstacles. The smooth versus the striated, in other words. While architecture's purpose remains constant, providing shelter from the natural elements and a community among its inhabitants, mobile and portable architectures herald the dawn of the age of new nomadism. The applications and uses are limitless. These buildings have no borders. Diversity of material palette, design style, and transportation methods are varied. Here's Buckminster Fuller with his Dymaxium dome, and 1998 artist take Stephen Brower's looking at the Fuller dome and the Dymaxion car, which, if you're familiar with that, was one of the precursor to the RV, a 3-wheeled vehicle, whose only shortcoming was that it would take a corner and tend to sort of flop over because its front wheel was in the front and it had a sort of heavy back end. But I think he was working on that one. So mobile architecture can then be defined not merely in terms of movable structures, but rather as a way of intelligently inhabiting a specific environment at a specific time and place in a way that better reacts to increasingly frequent social and environmental shifts. These fluvial forms are expressed best in the extreme sports world, where surfers meld with the breaking surfaces and the sea becomes the form giver, or the intuition and innovation of the skateboarder working off the urban infrastructure. The information age whets our appetite for the exploration of this unknown. As inquisitive social beings and innate explorers of the universe, we are standing at a new threshold of curiosity and movement. Biological and technological advancements reveal themselves in our everyday lives, echoing prophecies and environmental visions from American pulp science fiction. Architecture today rolls, flows, inflates, breathes, expands, multiplies, and contracts, finally hoisting itself up, as Archigram predicted at the end of the 1960s, to go in search of its next user. So I'm showing you just a few images that I find inspirational and things that I look at sort of outside of buildings. Certainly Wiley Byman's Airstream and the small, compact hotel rooms of Japan, making do with very little. The work of someone like Lucy Orta or Dre Wapner. These beautiful tent-like structures, very simple, elegant teardrops, kind of just hanging almost seamlessly. And this image, which actually now seems very archaic to me, but was something that I started using in my lecture, I'd say about 10 years ago, pretty much sums up my, my world, my office, my on-the-road experience. You know, the laptop and the iPod are ideas that I think haven't quite been implemented into the architectural vocabulary. Eventually, I feel that this razorfish image is a quintessential image in that everything will eventually be so small and so embedded that the idea of shelter might dissipate or might be found in a completely different way. New advancements in technologies found mainly in the automobile industry, in the aerospace industry, are starting to find themselves into the classroom or into production lines, but again, haven't quite made it that far. Fully automated manufacturing is something that's very common in certain parts of Europe, certainly in Germany, in Sweden, but we're very far from it when we look into our construction practices here in the US, especially I would imagine for the students that were involved in the solar decathlon, you know, hand building a product and then having to ship that across the country is challenging, burdensome. At OMD, I've been very interested in new materials, new technologies, green technologies. I produce a series of boxes of kind of hands-on material laboratory with Princeton Architectural Press. We did this for about a year so that it would offer you, as the end user, a chance to build up a material library and have a material sample there for your clients, eventual clients. I look a lot at the desert. This is Palm Springs. This is a pretty typical day in the desert. Wind power, the use of PV panels, solar panels, thermal photovoltaic panels, things that are pretty obvious that we've somehow forgotten how to use. This was a project that I had built with my students. I taught for about 10 years at Woodbury University in Burbank, which was a very simple project, outdoor pavilion. It was completely powered by the sun. Being a product of SciArc, I think I've been inundated by the idea of do-it-yourselfness, and I've also, being a product of Los Angeles, I'm fascinated by mobility in trucks, and I find pleasure by looking at various forms of trucks and what they can do. This question that Fuller raises of, Madam, what is the weight of your house, was something that was never posed to me when I was in school, but it's something that I need to ask myself every day in the work that I do now. So this is my house. I'm a big believer in sort of trying out what I spout off about. So this is my house. This is an early morning in Venice, California. This is a crane that's trucked or craned over the top of the house, a truck trailer. Very inexpensive addition. I think I spent about $2,300 on this structure. And I use this as a kind of ancillary space to the garden, kind of an easy exchange, I suppose, of interior and exterior space. One of my very first projects done with students, also at Woodbury, was the transformation of a truck into something we called the Eco Lab. And this was an experiment, I think, for all of us in terms of compact spaciousness and what you could actually do with an 8-foot wide modular unit using found recycled elements, handcrafted, all built by the students, and turned it into a mobile classroom that teaches children about the life of a tree and moves throughout Hollywood. It was a very successful project for us because it led us to a lot of other ideas. This one in particular was another project done with a fellow architect in Santa Monica, Larry Scarpa, where we started to look at manufactured housing. And we were given this old trailer, taking it apart, starting to realize, how shoddily crafted these things are, replacing some of the walls with steel and allowing it to be completely open to the elements. And this is used by a group of people that train people in construction. So they're simple ideas, simple projects, but got me started on my path and allowed me to understand more about what it was that I was grappling with. The idea of shipping containers, I suppose, fits naturally into this envelope. I lived for about 5 years in downtown Los Angeles in a very industrial area called the Brewery. It was an artist loft complex. And the fellow who owned that property was also a hoarder of materials and junk. He offered or gave me the opportunity, let's say, to create a house for him with all of the elements that were found on this property. So I picked out 4 shipping containers and 2 grain trailers and a bunch of other items that you'll see, making a sort of modest structure on a fairly big piece of property in LA, which is about 10,000 square feet. So the containers really just acted as these buffers, as these walls. Let's see, laser. And this is really just a house for one person. It's about 3,000 square feet. And in section, you can see that the grain trailers became 2 koi fish ponds, one was on the inside, one was on the outside of the house, and sort of united the water feature between the two. So here's the location. This is the 5 freeway running north and south. This is the brewery complex. About 350 artists live and work, and manufacturers live and work in this area. Downtown's over here, and SciArc is kind of over here right now. He also, being a true Angelino, doesn't walk to work. So even though he lives here and his office is here, he drives. So it was really important for him to have the house nestled in the back of the property, which would give him that natural experience of walking across the property to his car. You can't blame him. So this is the site, and this is where the materials came from. The entire landscape was actually introduced as well, but because this is part of the alluvial plain of the Los Angeles River, once we removed the tarmac and the concrete and planted, it was incredible what the wildlife did, almost instantaneously. And the birds that come and the butterflies that migrate through. So it's a very, the space is alive, it sort of breathes. There are 4 different kinds of containers. 2 are steel, 2 are aluminum. There was a lot of invention. This was probably the most collaborative project I've ever worked on for a client, because he was very involved in it. His first house was completed with Michael Rotundi, and I think they took about 5 years to do that together. This house was completed in about 3 months, so it was a very different process, and we were both very much involved in it. The house has a sort of natural breathing ability because of the way in which the windows are set, and you're able to move air through it passively. The roof is built up from a series of kind of rigid insulation and decking, so that there's air that will travel through this entire roof, and you hear it sometimes with the wind passing by. There's probably a total of 5 people that constructed this house: steel, glass, drywall, and an artist. And here's the client. There was also an interesting relationship between this fellow, David McCarskey, and then this is the client, Richard Carlson, because they knew each other for so long, and everyone who worked on this project also lived within this complex. And David McCarskey designed all of the furniture and there was an artist who installed all of his artwork, and so there was always a kind of knowing about what all of the elements would be in the end, even though we weren't really sure how they would fit together. This is a flagstone waterfall that circulates this water for the koi fish pond. This is a small glass bridge. What's interesting about koi fish is that they don't have stomachs, so that whatever's going into them, and they eat constantly, is constantly coming out, so there's a need for a very strong pump. The house has a sort of faint aroma of kind of the tropics, which is where the client spends a lot of his time. So it's a little dank, I would say, but in a good way. So I can't say that I haven't looked at history. You know, people that have come predecessors, you know, for all of us, I think are important, and it's important to know where you position yourself. From the 1920s, you know, Corbusier was starting to think about prefabrication. Certainly, Conrad Waxman and Walter Gropius were already way ahead of things in the late 40s. This is 46. This is something called the packaged house, where they were looking at panelized systems. They actually had a whole truck line that they invented that went along with that system because it was done in meters as opposed to, it was a metric system. There was the Lustron house from the 1940s. This is 49. This is a metal paneled house. This is something you're all familiar with. This is the Eames house, again from the 1949. What's interesting about the Eames house is that they had designed it in a certain way, had come up with a system of panels and packaged system, but then constructed it and put it together in a completely different way that wasn't even what they had anticipated. This is a great house to visit when you're in Los Angeles. One person that I think I admire tremendously is Jean Prouvé. This is his Maison Tropicale, and this is also from 49. So it was an incredibly busy moment in history, obviously because it was the end of World War II, and there was a lot of interest in technology, and there were a lot of craft people that were looking for ways to put their industry back into production. And then finally, Richard Rogers from the Zip Up House from 1968. You know, this, you can't help but think of Neil Denari, you know, or a lot of the art or the architecture that you see right now. But he was already starting to think about these kind of small, you know, electric cars, the smart cars of the past. There's a lot of different ways to think about prefabrication, and I've dabbled in probably 4 different types. This is a modular steel method. I was first asked by Dwell magazine in about 2001 if I had a design for a prefab house that was very early on, before people started talking about this as a concept. The word, I think, prefab wasn't even popularized. And so I spent the weekend and came up with a project because I'd been thinking about it for some time and working on it. And that was published, and that project was really the instigator, I think, for all of the work that came after that, because then the phone started ringing, and you know, I get asked that question by students a lot. You know, how do you start? Well, you start by building something or publishing something, and then being prepared for the phone to ring and taking orders. That building became my model unit, and I use this as our show house. This is a steel moment frame. You can see these corner posts, and there's one kind of secondary post, steel chassis and a steel roof. Sits on its own set of axles and wheels. Those axles and wheels get popped off when they arrive on the site, but the entire building stays as one unit. The maximum width that you can move a single unit down the road in California is about 16 feet, and you can go up to approximately 80 feet in length, and then you have a height limit of about 15.6. So this little unit was, again, an idea that I had, and I thought, you know, if I could just produce one thing, then I could satisfy, I think, my interests in this. And I was able to cobble together a series of local fabricators, local business people that would contribute to that, from the flooring, that was a bamboo, and there's coconut palm flooring. there's a whole series of different technologies that are embedded within this house. And I use this, it's right down the street from my office, to show people what the potential of just what a single module or modular building might feel like. It's very spacious on the inside. It's very different, kind of the volume from the outside. This is a polycarbonate front panel. It's a shed roof, so at its highest level, it has an operable skylight, a very simple idea that just allows it to be passively cooled. And then there are heating panels in the ceiling called people heaters that give it its heat in the winter. From that project, clients started walking in the door, and we started to explore, a variety of different building types. Still on smaller lots. This is a lot in Santa Monica, very small. It's about 24 feet wide by about 125 feet long. So the entire house is a 16-foot wide building. It's made up of 4 modules. And here it is out in the factory. This was probably the greatest challenge for me. It's easy to make a rendering. It's hard to find someone who would build it. And what I find in this industry is it's very set in its ways, and people are not very interested in retooling. So you have to be a very good spokesperson and be able to convince someone, of your vision. And eventually this factory went along and has been my fabricator since. We've done about, I'd say, a dozen houses together and a couple of schools. So the modules, as you can see, are kind of being pumped out. Everything is built at one level, which allows for a lot more precision and craft in the field or at the factory. There's a lot less waste in this method of construction, about 30% less waste because a lot of that material will get recycled and put back into the building. Small things like the workers don't have to drive around the city all day. They're just going to one location. Things are built in incredibly short periods of time. Within a week, the entire structural system of these buildings are complete, all 4 of them. Within 3 months, we're ready to truck out our buildings. Depending on the scale of the building, this is a very tight site, so there are 2 cranes that are operating. I'd say the heroes behind a lot of this work are the crane operators. It's amazing to watch the choreography of the relationship between the power lines and the cranes. The modules weigh, this one was 11 tons, I believe, just for one. This is, it's like a barn raising, but your stomach you feel every twinge. So depending on what we are doing for a finish or an interior, will determine how much is done in the factory. So this one has a smooth trellis stucco at its base, and that was done on site, and everything else was pretty much completed in the factory. This is about a 2,200 square foot building. Very simple fixtures. This is just an IKEA kitchen. The cost of this building was $240 a square foot, which did not include the land. So this is, for me, the most exciting moment is the factory moment and bringing the client to the factory, because it's really rare work where, you as the architect gets to expose your idea fully to a client prior to the end of construction. So they walk in and they see, all of these large Lego pieces, and then they have to sort of imagine them coming together. But then they it's the basis for the trust, I think, in the relationship once they actually see the real units. This was a house that was an addition to an existing structure. And it was also built from 4 modules, but it's a single level. And I was very interested in creating a private kind of interior courtyard. This image I always like because it makes me think of a Gordon Matta Clark image where, as opposed to taking the building apart, we're trying to pull it together. It's a remarkable experience. So this relationship, between, again, sort of the interior and the exterior is something that I'm very interested in. I'm developing landscape now as part of the vocabulary for each of these buildings. This is a temporary installation, I think, of the grass, but they're doing a series of edible gardens and the fencing and kind of water features that complement, I think, the living space from the inside and out. I've also been working quite a bit with SIP panels, structurally insulated panels, which I think are terrific. They come pre-cut, pre-channeled. There's also a whole system now that's made of agroboard. This is with a variety of different infills, some soy products. This one is a styrofoam and an OSB board. This I first designed for an invited competition for Dwell magazine, and we called it the Swell House. And I was thinking about things that would be smaller, kind of bite-sized units or chunks that I could then take apart and deliver to the site in different ways, in different locations, because some sites are incredibly challenging. So if you could have maybe a simpler system that didn't involve so many pieces, my thinking was, it would be a smoother operation. And then, of course, you can configure them in a whole variety of different ways, and presto, you have your house. So this was the first client that saw that idea and hired us to do a house for him in Venice. He's a music producer, so part of this project is a recording studio. And what's fascinating about the SIP panels is the acoustical value, not just the thermal value, but the acoustics. It's incredibly tight, it's incredibly efficient. The SIP panels, these in particular came from Phoenix, and within about a 3-day period, it was installed. They're easy to maneuver. So you can see, it's 2 or 3 people on the site. They're able to use it without the use of a crane, which was pretty important to us at that time. And then this is the house, really, again, down the street from my office. I find that if I have clients in my neighborhood, I don't have to drive, which I appreciate. So this was pre-landscape. One thing a client said to me once that I thought was interesting is that the sooner you put the plants in the ground, the quicker they're working for you, because as you're sleeping, they're working. So that's something to keep in mind when your clients are dragging their feet about landscape. This is a concrete radiant floor, clean lines. He's a New Yorker. He's very interested in, again, a modernist feel. And then this was a hybrid project between those two systems. This was just a recent project I built with students at Taliesin, or they built, and I was helping them. We were looking at prefabricated options. We were trying to come up with a new system that the apprentices could collaborate on. They all build their own dwellings out in the desert, as you probably know, but they haven't done anything that was for the public, I think, really since Frank Lloyd Wright's death. They haven't built anything new. So this was a very controversial project for Taliesin. This is in Phoenix, but it worked out extraordinarily well. The students, I think, are magnificent. They're very inspired, hard-working. The heat of the day. This was probably last March, I think, out in Phoenix. Everything built off-site, and a very simple unit, 12 feet wide by about 50 feet long, all built from SIPs with that same steel chassis, and elevated a little bit off the ground, sitting over this arroyo. This building's completely self-sufficient, powered by its own grid, and it's used as a guest residence for visiting scholars. And it's become part of the tour, which is pretty interesting as well. It also was a way for the students to explore a lot of landscape issues that they were interested in, between gray water systems and water evaporation and collection from the desert. And then this last project of this type is a project we're just started construction in Big Sur. A very interesting client, a woman who owns quite a bit of property and is interested in, you know, how green green can be. So this project is completely off the grid. It has a backup system of a propane tank, but will only be needed 30 days out of the year. So we spent considerable amounts of time with a lot of consultants coming up with the best design solution for this particular site. What's interesting in a project like that is that you have to know every single item that will ever be powered in the house, you know, down to an electric toothbrush or you know, your computer system, because it's all calculated sort of backwards. The reason that this house is designed for this in the way it is because the site is so challenging and there is no power on the site. So everything has to be brought into its location. And it's a very small house, but has had more attention given to it than I think anything else I've ever worked on. So we'll see that completed by April. I've done a few things with schools, which I think brings me back to where I started from, which is really my basis, my educational basis of teaching, and something that I really believe in quite strongly. Same factory, and it's interesting because the same factory that builds my houses builds the schools as well. And this was awarded, was the first green prefabricated school in Los Angeles, which is, you know, for me it's not an extraordinary project. It's a very simple, modest project. But what it did is offer the students natural light and a lot of ventilation, and then a strong tie back into the grounds, into the nature. So I worked very closely with a good friend of mine who's a landscape architect to create butterfly gardens and edible gardens. And the life of the school actually happens quite a bit outside, amphitheaters and such. In some ways, I think I'm most proud of this project because of the users. It's very limiting in some ways to do private residential buildings, and when you're working at sort of in bigger scale, it makes you feel better. Some of the materials, this is a biofiber. It's made from recycled sunflower seeds, and the floor is a rubber and a cork, which comes in different colors. I was very interested in the way that light and color would affect the life of a student in this classroom. I still think a lot about the future. I get asked quite a bit about my feelings. You know, what will the world be like in 100 years from now? We just finished a competition for the city of Los Angeles for 2106, or 2100, whatever year it was. And I think about materials. I think about the way in which we may inhabit the planet. This project is called the Hydra House, where these Hydra's units and cells start to interact with each other, and there's lots of layers of different materials that work off of each other, from aerogels to technogels and luminex and hybrid solar cells, and even the idea of creating energy from salt, which is something that we're starting to see more and more. I like to think about dwelling in a very, without gravity, without anything that sort of holds me back, because I think it keeps you fresh. And then I also, this was part of our competition, thinking about water as being this obviously precious resource, and that water will eventually become so precious that it will become the oil for your generation. The future of mobile architecture is unfolding rapidly. As our buildings become more portable and adaptable, they become more useful. Before long, we will shed the bulk and excess of static environments as we look to Generation Mobile for its long-term solutions for the uprooting of today's built structures. It is this recognition of the fluidity of circumstances, the mobility of demographics and information, and an increasing capacity for architecture to respond to fluidity, whether it's through low-tech ad hoc vernaculars or through high-tech kinetics and embedded computation. From solo dwelling to eco-friendly housing, I see opportunities for sustainable design ventures that can be employed here and now. At Office of Mobile Design, we are in sync with the growing grassroots do-it-yourself change for designers across the country that are becoming impatient and that are looking for ways to inject a more personal language into a more social gathering. I'm going to leave you with this last image from Richard Avedon from 1980. This is a fellow named Richard Garber, and he was wandering on Interstate 15 in Provo, Utah. The drifter, as Richard Avedon calls him, you know, in some ways represents a lot of my feelings and thinking about, you know, where we are, where we're heading, you know, who we're working for, who we're sort of working against, and ways in which I think we can begin to improve upon society. Thank you. Sure. I'd be happy to take some questions.
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions. So.
Maybe from some of the students, something specific. Yes?
It seems like a lot of your prefabricated work, obviously, you can see the sustainable facility related to that as part of it. It seems like you're also moving and I'm wondering, in our age of like energy conservation, architecture moves, inherently problematic, and I mean, be like truly sustainable should be all stay still.
A building, you know, I guess I wouldn't agree with that. You know, if any material, you know, probably the clothes that you're wearing, the shoes on your feet, you know, the hair products you use, shampoo, food you eat, are all coming from different sources, right? And I've heard a lot of different explanations about, you know, what is the perfect distance, right? I've heard that within a 500-mile radius, you know, is the sort of perfect distance between transportation hubs and sort of, and what's reasonable in terms of getting, you know, materials or moving materials out. There's a great movie maybe that you should look at called The Gods Must Be Crazy. That there's a really interesting scene where this Coke bottle is dropped into the middle of this tribe, right, and they become obsessed with it, and it often makes me think about what happens when you do bring a foreign material into, you know, an unlikely place, and how does that trigger other effects. But you can't put your head in the sand. I mean, you can't ignore the fact that this is, you know, we're globalized. We're working, I mean, Houston has this incredible port system, right, and is moving things constantly. It's still a lot cheaper to fabricate in parts of China than it is to build here, you know, in this country. And you know, I'm not out to change the world of manufacturing. I'm sort of interested in where I fit into this scenario. And for me, I found that working locally with manufacturers and sort of working within my region, maybe trucking things up to a maximum of 100 miles has been a good thing for my clients. It's been it's more cost effective and less wasteful. So, I mean, I think that eventually you take a position about something, you know, and this just happens to be the position I've taken.
You said one of your projects was about $240 a square foot. Do you have any idea like how much it would cost through traditional methods to build a people?
Yeah, I mean, yes. That's a great number for Los Angeles, right? Stephen Ehrlich, who was just recently lecturing, he doesn't, you know, he won't talk to a client unless he's at like $1,000 a square foot. So, you know, everything's relative. So, you know, when I talk about that number, there's a lot in it, right? There's cabinetry, there's all your finishes, there's everything sort of within a 5-foot radius. There's mechanical, electrical, structural engineering, permitting. So in the world of LA, that's a great number. Could I do a stick-built house for about 200 square foot right now? Probably. You know, would it take 9 to 12 months over 3 months? So, you know, there's a lot of different things to weigh when it comes to.
My next question is does this seem to be more? I mean, obviously, where you're working is very LA-centric, but what do you see as like the walls that are preventing you from making the costs lower so that the rest of the country can benefit?
You know, this is the best answer I've heard to that question by somebody else. When Chrysler comes up with, you know, their new model, probably a bad example, but when Fiat comes out with their new model, they don't charge that first client for the cost of what it took to come out with that new model, right? It's broken up over, you know, tens and thousands of cars. In architecture, we charge the client for that entire package. You know, the way in which you truly bring these numbers down is in mass production, mass customization, sort of the dream, I think, that many architects have had since, you know, since birth, since they picked up their Legos. It doesn't always work out like that. You know, I found that I can't mass produce the same thing over and over again. I'm not that interested in it. The value of land in Los Angeles is so high that nobody wants the same thing. The zoning codes are different in every single area, the height restrictions, the setbacks. You know, maybe it's a little looser in Houston, but I would guess that it's not. You know, maybe if you're out in, you know, pick a state where there's a lot more space, you know, you're not as restricted. So what I'm trying to do is work within a kind of restricted area, but give choice and give alternatives to what, you know, what is out there, which is not always pretty. So, you know, there's a line between it.
Yeah, I think so. Do you ever think that you reached out to any large developers and, you know, people that are responsible for building this?
You know, it's an obvious question, development, right? You would think that and I hear from developers all the time. Those are the people that call all the time because they're all about the bottom line. So if they can, you know, somehow save 50 cents in their spreadsheet, they will, but they're also the most cautious. No one wants to be the first, right? So, you know, show me the development that's done like that and then I'll buy into it. And I've found, there's probably one good example I've seen. There's one good one in London. There's a good one in San Jose. But it's been very slow to take off, and yet it makes a lot of sense, right? You're saving incredible amounts of time. You don't have to worry as much about security on large development sites where materials are walking off, you know, as you're building and things are kind of going up. I think that there's been, you know, historically there's incredible examples of that, but it just hasn't. And then we did have this kind of economic problem recently, so I think everything sort of went on hold. There are also questions, I think, when you get into very large high-rises that, you know, I'm not looking to duplicate the amount of material, you know, on every single level. So there are advantages and disadvantages to it, but I do hope that would be my next step. Yes?
Another design is designed to be mobile. What about the life expectancy, the lifespan of the design, and how sustainable is that?
Well, most of the buildings that I showed you, you know, the prefabricated houses will not move again, right? They could be dismantled, they could be taken apart, but those are really thought more in terms of their construction attributes or off-site, you know, construction. A lot of them are steel, probably built to a higher level and quality than most, I'd say, most residential building in Los Angeles that tends to just be stick frame. So I don't, you know, these aren't trailers as you typically think of trailers. There is a project that we are shortlisted for right now, which is a trailer park in Santa Monica, which is very dear to my heart. Like for me, that would be the ideal project, because it's really about kind of small spaces and small communities and thinking about how these pieces interact. So we're probably going to be working with buildings that are closer to $75 a square foot, and it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. But the goal is not to build cheaper. It's to build better with a higher level of craft.